So I think, having established that the acoustics here are very good, I should just ask all the same, can you hear me? Is there anybody who can't hear me? Can't hear me asking whether you can hear me. If that's all right. I believe this has got awfully good state-of-the-art sound systems. So I'll plunge in. Second only to the late and misanthropic play Timon of Athens, the narrative poem Venus and Adonis probably is Shakespeare's least read work. From the point of view of scholars and critics, Venus and Adonis presents a paradox. Because the poem is so well constructed, with brilliantly calibrated shifts of pace, tone, structure, and setting, it presents virtually no difficulties of meaning or vocabulary, apart from the difficulties which may connect to any poem composed something over 400 years ago. Technically, Venus and Adonis appears flawless. Rhyme and metre are perfectly sustained, and within its own stylistic terms, nothing seems false, awkward, or clumsy. Some readers have found its erotic subject matter repellent and/or embarrassing. I shall come to C.S. Lewis's comments shortly, but that is essentially a matter of taste. He doesn't say it's badly written or it's an imperfect work. Anyway, I'll tell you, we'll come to Lewis in a minute. Shakespeare has fashioned the poem with such care that even 400 years later, very little needs to be explained or amended. As readers, it appears that all that we are required to do is to enjoy the poem, allowing ourselves to be carried along through its brilliant shifts of tone and pace, the variable passions that Anthony Mortimer, I think the very best of the very few people who've actually written a book about Venus and Adonis, the variable passions that Anthony Mortimer takes as the title of his excellent book, and I've given you his details. Venus and Adonis is not designed for the stage. Though it's as long as a fairly short play, the lucid and fast-moving narrative is designed either to be perused visually by a single reader or else to be read aloud by a single speaker. The narrative doesn't lend itself readily either to adaptation or to updating through full-scale theatrical performance, though this has sometimes been attempted, perhaps most notably in John Blow's opera of the same name, Venus and Adonis, of 1683, but it bears only a loose relation to Shakespeare's poem, and the John Blow version deviates from it in one major respect. Venus and Adonis in Blow's opera are introduced as mutual lovers sitting together upon a couch, embracing one another, whereas in Shakespeare's poem, Adonis sulkily rejects all of Venus's advances. One could say there are a dozen love scenes, but in fact none of them are love scenes because Adonis never responds. Then there's just one other late version it's worth mentioning, I think. Colley Cibber's full-length theatrical version, performed at Drury Lane in 1781, which owes much more to Shakespeare's version of the myth. But this too has major divergences. The most major one being that Adonis in Cibber's version is presented as being responsive to Venus's amorous advances. But also it's one could say diluted or expanded the personnel because the god Mars appears as a third major character, whereas in Shakespeare's version essentially there are only two human characters. In just one more sentence on Colley Cibber's stage direction, Adonis lies down while she hides him with the boughs, suggests very strongly that mutual lovemaking is about to take place, whereas in Shakespeare's version, Venus will achieve no more than a single and semi-comic, from the reader's point of view, forced embrace. So far as I'm aware, the only faithful adaptation of Shakespeare's narrative poem for the stage is Greg Doran's enchanting rendition of it. I don't know if any of you saw it in 2004. Greg Doran adapted it as A Mask for Puppets, Royal Shakespeare Company, 2004. Yes, so you can see it's very sweetly and charmingly done. Actually, I've seen it I was lucky enough. I saw it, I think, 3 times, once in London and twice in Stratford. It was delightful. Why it hasn't been brought back in this great anniversary year, I can't think, because it's enchanting. And it was hugely successful when it was performed. So much for dramatisations of Venus and Adonis, which of course is not a drama. For more than 70 years, Shakespeare's poem was hugely admired, enjoyed and imitated. Within weeks of its first printing in April 1593, quotations from Venus and Adonis appeared in other works. Early admirers and imitators of the poem included Thomas Edwards, Michael Drayton and Thomas Heywood, three very promising poets of the early 1590s, more or less Shakespeare's coevals as well. Sometime after 1598, and bearing witness to the continuing nature of the poem's very great popular success, Gabriel Harvey remarked in one of his celebrated annotations that the younger sort takes much delight in Shakespeare's Venus and Adonis. It was extraordinarily successful in print. Between 1593 and 1675, the poem enjoyed at least 16 reprints, an extraordinary number, sometimes reprints several years running. And almost certainly some haven't survived, because there were so many single survivors of a single year's printing. So many of them survive only in single, sometimes fragmentary copies, all the others having been apparently read to death. It's quite likely, therefore, that the true full tally of the poem's 17th century reprints was even more numerous. Venus and Adonis must also have been a very welcome money spinner for its 7 or 8 successive publishers. The combination of many editions and very few copies surviving from those many editions does show that this was a book that wasn't just purchased, it was eagerly read again and again. And here you have on the top right the Bodleian's copy, which is a unique survival of the first edition, and a much more clumsily printed later edition, which I've forgotten what number it is. It's about the 7th or 8th reprinting, I think. But the fact that Shakespeare had also, How did it come about that such a spectacularly popular and undoubtedly authentic work by Shakespeare subsequently disappeared from view? In 1660, when the public theatres in London finally reopened after 18 bleak years of Puritan-led closure, many of Shakespeare's plays were once again published and performed, now with female as well as male actors on the stage. These performances being hugely enjoyed as adapted to suit Restoration tastes. But the fact that Shakespeare had also composed 3 major works in verse, Venus and Adonis, 1593, Lucrece, 1594, and Shakespeare's sonnets, 1609, seems to have been largely overlooked in the Restoration. Virtually all of Shakespeare's plays were now available in massive collected editions, otherwise known as folios. And Shakespeare's continuing success as a playwright whose works could be either read privately or viewed publicly on stage, apparently almost entirely eclipsed the early popularity of the 2 narrative poems. I say almost because, strangely, Lucrece, which is a much more difficult poem and less pleasing and certainly not amorous, did lend itself to some later adaptations. But some of the selfsame features that had made Venus and Adonis such a tearaway success with young Elizabethan readers seem now to have counted against it. It is, as we shall see, a highly sensuous narrative, and its sexual explicitness may have appeared especially shocking to 17th and early 18th century readers as female literacy expanded. It was perhaps the kind of book that in some households had to be hidden away from well-brought-up young ladies. Nevertheless, it has been admired rather fleetingly by some later poets. In a letter to his friend Reynolds, John Keats remarked with some exaggeration, rather oddly, it's a rather incoherent sentence. This is just the half sentence of Keats to Reynolds. Shakespeare has left nothing to say about nothing or anything. And that's applied to Venus and Adonis. I'm not quite sure what he was trying to get at, but I think he was saying, I like Venus and Adonis. Well, Coleridge paid tribute to the poem's eloquent sensuousness, remarking that in Venus and Adonis, you seem to be told nothing, but to see and hear everything. A few modern critics, however, have strongly disliked Venus and Adonis, apparently because of its sexual frankness. It was especially detested by C.S. Lewis, I've come back to him, who claimed in his 1954 study of English literature in the 16th century, this is now Lewis, this flushed, panting, perspiring, suffocating, loquacious creature is supposed to be the goddess of love herself, the golden Aphrodite. It will not do. If the poem is not meant to arouse disgust, it was very foolishly written. I think the Ulster Protestant is coming out in Lewis very, very strongly in his response to Venus and Adonis. That's all he says about it. And it's actually, it is a substantial work, which is as long as a play, a shortish play. However, I think this may tell us more about Lewis than about Shakespeare. A rather more pertinent objection, perhaps particularly in our present era, to Shakespeare's poem, might be that it could be viewed as celebrating paedophilia, were it not that Shakespeare's treatment presents such love, that is, of a mature woman to an immature boy, such love is simply impossible, even for a goddess. How can we restore this brilliant verse narrative to the status that it deserves? As already mentioned, Venus and Adonis, or actually I haven't mentioned it, I think, was dedicated to the 19-year-old Henry Wriothesley, Earl of Southampton, who evidently bestowed a very good reward on the poet for the dedication, as Shakespeare then went on in the following year to dedicate Lucrece, his other long, non-dramatic poem, a year later. The young nobleman's reward for Venus and Adonis probably supported the poet and his family financially while he wrote Lucrece during a particularly prolonged period when London's public theatres had been closed as a measure to limit the spread of plague. Lucrece, Shakespeare's second narrative poem, also sold well, but about almost exactly half as well in terms of the number of printings as Venus and Adonis, with Lucrece being a very, very moral and serious, powerful poem, perhaps didn't please the sort of Inns of Court younger sort in the way that Venus and Adonis clearly did. Just under 1,200 lines, Venus and Adonis is as long as a moderately short play. I'm going to limit myself to just three of its most remarkable features. The first is its brilliantly flexible style and pace, which succeeds in delivering some narrative passages in a very economical manner, while many of Venus's speeches are cunningly prolonged to gain and retain the attention of the sulky and reluctant Adonis. The second notable feature, which I shall examine briefly, concerns Shakespeare's unique ability to describe living creatures, what I have called animals, tame and wild in a natural environment. Only in narrative verse, rather than drama, was it possible for Shakespeare to write in this way at such length. Finally, I shall glance or gaze at one single image very late on in Venus and Adonis. So Shakespeare's pace and ability both for concision and inflation, for writing very briefly and writing in great length. The poet's, starting with concision, the poet's adept handling of swift pace, are we on to the next? Yes, we're about to be, next slide, is fully in evidence in the very first stanza. Even as the sun, with purple-coloured face, had ta'en his last leave of the weeping morn, rose-cheeked Adonis hied him to the chase. Hunting he loved, but love he laughed to scorn. Sick-thoughted Venus makes amain unto him, and like a bold-faced suitor, gins to woo him. As Coleridge remarks, in 6 simple lines, Shakespeare puts the reader in possession of the whole argument of the poem. Just 6 lines, it's brilliantly quick-paced. For the first 2 lines, we learn that the narrative begins at dawn, whose early morning dew is indicated in the weeping morn in line 2. Lines 3 to 4, as the sun rises, the beautiful youth Adonis, mounted high up himself, as the sun is rising, he is mounting his horse and is eager to start hunting. Hunting is his sole delight. He takes no interest in love. There's a reason for this. In Shakespeare's version of the myth, Adonis is not a full-grown young man, but a pre-pubertal child, something Venus seems to overlook for most of the poem. Nevertheless, Venus and Adonis, the goddess of love, has instantly fallen in love with the boy, and in lines 5 to 6, she pretends to woo him. We're carried a long way in those opening six lines. There are already strong indications that the tale will not end happily. The sun is personified as the fickle lover of the god of Eos, the weeping morn. Adonis's rosy cheeks reflect his childish appearance, and the goddess, sick with love, embarks on what the reader anticipates will be an extended chronicle of her attempts to woo him. There's a further pattern of iteration. The poem opens with an abandoned female, that is the goddess of dawn, personified as the weeping morn. 1100 lines further on, the poem concludes with another abandoned female deity, this time a much more big-time deity, Venus, the goddess of love, who again leaves unsatisfied and weeping, drawn skywards in her light chariot by silver doves who take flight far beyond our mortal sphere, holding their course to Paphos, where their queen means to immure herself and not be seen. Though often playful in tone, Shakespeare's treatment of the myth is inescapably tragic. It is much darker than the passages in Ovid's Metamorphoses from which it mainly derives, and in which Venus appears to enjoy a period of successful lovemaking, as well as of storytelling to amuse the fair youth who is her current lover. But Shakespeare does follow Ovid in concluding his poem with an etiological conceit. That's it. Some of you, I'm sure, will know what an etiological conceit, but just for those who don't, there it is. That is a mythical narrative that seeks to explain the way the world has turned out. This story tells us why usually something negative, has happened. Because of Venus's failure in love, the goddess of love warns us that, since thou art dead, lo, here I prophesy, sorrow on love hereafter shall attend. It shall be waited on with jealousy, find sweet beginning but unsavoury end, ne'er settled equally but high or low, that all love's pleasure shall not match his woe. Shakespeare was to return to this truism in the play that is most closely connected to Venus and Adonis, that is A Midsummer Night's Dream, which in its very first act has the echoing dialogue beginning, and most people will know this an awful lot better than they know Venus and Adonis. The course of true love never did run smooth. But to get back to Venus and Adonis, Venus's prophecy is bad news for us mortals. We humans are destined for all eternity, according to this poem, to experience love which is always imperfect, and sometimes, as in Romeo and Juliet, written a couple of years later, positively tragic. Venus and Adonis and Romeo and Juliet share a tragic vision of human love as always essentially doomed. However, A Midsummer Night's Dream, a play probably written to celebrate a courtly marriage, concludes with a festive and almost riotous explosion of merry marriages and comical sports. And we'll see in a minute there are other things that link Venus and Adonis to A Midsummer Night's Dream. But to return to the driving theme, as the narrative unfolds, it becomes apparent that Adonis is stubbornly unresponsive to Venus's lovemaking. He's reluctant to permit even a single kiss, except on the boyish, embarrassed condition that he can then finally make his escape from Venus. The goddess's boast of having been wooed in the past by the god Mars is entirely wasted on him, as are her playful promises. And here it does almost seem as if he's treating the boy as a boy who is to be entertained in a puppet show. He's now telling Adonis some of the clever things that she can do, that he ought to be responsive to. Bid me discourse, I will enchant thine ear, or like a fairy, trip upon the green, or like a nymph with long dishevelled hair, dance on the sands, and yet no footing seen. But while the poem's readers may be excited by these magical enchantments that she's promising, Adonis is simply bored and fed up, exclaiming impatiently, "Fie, no more of love! The sun doth burn my face, I must remove." He's a pre-pubertal boy, his skin doesn't stand up to noonday sun, and he's getting very fed up with his large, dominating goddess. Since Adonis appears to be totally unmoved by her own surpassing beauty, Venus is driven to the desperate measure of praising herself, resorting to sexual innuendos which may again be greatly relished by the poem's human readers, but will get nowhere with the callow boy. Graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower where the pleasant fountains lie. But after this prolonged wooing, sequence, which does go on for a very long time and is very, very ingenious, but it can't all be represented here, everything suddenly changes. Pity, she cries, some favour, some remorse. Just ends with, after many, many lines of ingenious wooing, this almost pathetic line by Venus, but it's followed, this is in a couplet. Pity, she cries, some favour, some remorse. Away he springs and hasteth to his horse. In contrast to the deliberate delaying tactics of the amorous goddess, a new kind of urgency now takes over. The pace speeds up, leading to the poem's next phase, in which animal activity will prevail over human. That's my part one. Now part two, part three, animals, tame and wild. There is one other work by Shakespeare in which animal life is almost as abundant and varied as it is in Venus and Adonis. This is A Midsummer Night's Dream, which I think we probably all know rather well, with its nocturnal scenes in a wood near Athens, and most of the action, whereas in Venus and Adonis all the action takes place in a wood. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, its most memorable scenes are in the wood near Athens, and its vivid allusions, favourable or otherwise, to more than 20 living creatures, such as spotted snakes, thorny hedgehogs, and weaving spiders. In Venus and Adonis, more than 22 different creatures are invoked, many of which are described in close detail. Some creatures are cited by the narrator as metaphors. Look how a bird is tangled in a net, or so fastened in her arms Adonis lies. Or this time Venus speaks, I'll be a park, and thou shalt be my deer. Feed where thou wilt, on mountain or in dale. So she's almost inviting the boy to eat her, which he's not going to do. Or this time it's again the voice of the narrator rather than a Venus that we hear, celebrating Venus's magical weightlessness. He's got so many party tricks that some boys really might be amused by, but this boy isn't. I'll be a park, and thou shalt be my deer. Feed where thou wilt, on mountain or in dale. And this time it's the voice of the narrator that we hear, celebrating Venus's magical weightlessness, which, as I've already suggested, Adonis seems to be entirely unimpressed by. As falcons to the lure, away she flies. The grass stoops not, she treads on it so light. So another magic trick, she can walk on long grass and the long grass doesn't bend under her. She's usually shown in art as a sort of sexily well-covered female, but she has a magical effect on the environment that she inhabits. The central narrative, all of which takes place out of doors, also includes many animals, real or material, who perform active roles in moving the narrative forward. There are only 2 human characters, but there are quite a good handful also of animal characters. The most notable and substantial one being Adonis's horse, who is described by the narrator as an ideal steed, round-hoofed. It's almost as if someone's going in to sort of choose the very best horse out of a large stable of very magnificent horses. Round-hoofed, short-jointed, fetlocks shag and long, broad breast, full eye, small head and nostril wide, high crest, short ears, straight legs and passing strong, thin mane, thick tail, broad buttock, tender hide. Look, what a horse should have, he did not lack, save a proud rider on so proud a back. However, this splendid horse that has carried Adonis into the thick of the woodland, this splendid horse becomes utterly unmanageable when he encounters a young mare in heat. Ignoring his young master's desperate commands, the horse breaks free from his harness and gallops off to join his mate, never to be seen again. The horse's large size and healthy sexual vigour provide a striking contrast to Adonis's childish weakness and prepubertal naivety. Perhaps the boy was not quite big enough to maintain successful control of a full-sized horse. Also, fatally, as the reader will probably, even somebody reading it the first time will guess, the loss of his horse will eventually leave the boy with no safe or speedy way back out of the forest. He has no way of knowing his way home, whatever his home was, which we aren't told. From the earlier passage onwards, with the narrative still barely past, this is the horse description, with the narrative barely past its first quarter, Venus, supposedly the ultimate embodiment of fleshly delight, seems culpably blind to the human needs of Adonis, who is getting sunburnt and sweaty, and he might like some lunch, I don't know, that's not mentioned, but there's a sort of sense that the more he drives on, Venus drives on her rather physical but also rhetorically ample wooing, the more poor little Adonis really just doesn't want to be there. And then Venus eventually abandons him like a babe in the woods with no means of escaping from the forest. Venus is a goddess and definitely not what we might now describe as a responsible adult. Meanwhile, Adonis is an inexperienced boy who has no way of finding his way home, a fear that he himself voices 400 lines later, a line I find particular. I mean, it's a long poem, but I find this line particularly touching. I'd like to have a little boy to say it. Well, now 'tis dark, and going I shall fall. He's going to trip over, it's dark, sun has set, he has no idea how to get back home. Returning to the earlier passage, still desperate for some response from the boy, Venus pretends to faint, prompting a brief comic episode in which Adonis, perhaps as if it was a sick horse or something, has a go at reviving her. And this is how he tries to revive her. He wrings her nose, he strikes her on the cheeks, he bends her fingers, holds her pulses hard, he chafes her lips. And as Adonis does this, it's the first time he has made any kind of physical advance on his side to the goddess. He's too innocent to observe the fact that Venus is very much enjoying physical contact with the child, even if it isn't of an essentially amorous kind. But eventually, Adonis appears to have learned something from his enforced dialogues with the overpowering Venus. And he delivers a remarkably eloquent lecture. It comes very surprising from this little boy, but he seems to know a lot about moral differences. An eloquent lecture on the essential difference between love and lust. Perhaps he was taught this by his tutor, and how important it was to reject lust. But this is the very moment when the poem's direction becomes irreversibly tragic. Breaking away from Venus, Adonis flees, and homeward through the dark lawn runs apace. Meanwhile, Venus also finds herself alone in the forest, and in total darkness, vainly attempting to comfort herself with tales of love. After a miserable night, the longed-for dawn is heralded by lovely birdsong. Lo, hear the gentle lark, weary of rest, from his moist cabinet mounts up on high. So we've gone from one dawn which was hopeful to the next dawn which is tragic. The onset of morning might perhaps bring some solace to Venus, but it doesn't. Rushing through thorny bushes which scrape her lightly clad legs, by this she hears the hounds are at a bay, that is, the hunting hounds. In huntsman's language, the bay, I expect lots of you know this, but I had to look it up. The bay is the climactic moment when a hunted animal turns round to face its hunters. It's giving up, essentially. It's wounded. It's not going to get anywhere. Venus, in a trembling ecstasy, now experiences seeing these wounded, defeated hounds that things have gone horribly wrong. She experiences a terrible apprehension that rather than being successfully pursued by a human huntsman, the boar himself has broken away from the chase and has fatally wounded the young boy Adonis. The grim news of the fatal encounter is confirmed in a dialogue between Venus, who uses words, and the injured hounds in painful howls. There are 3 stanzas of this. I'll just read one of them. Here, kennelled in a brake, she finds a hound and asks, this is Venus speaking, now in a very different tone of voice. Here, kennelled in a brake, she finds a hound and asks the weary caitiff for his master. And there another, licking of his wound against venomed sores, the only sovereign plaster. And here she meets another, sadly scowling, to whom she speaks, and he replies with howling. This is at once physically unsparing and beautifully accurate. Injured animals, including human beings, do indeed lick their wounds if they have no more modern remedy. Lick their wounds with saliva as the most efficacious treatment for their injuries. The miserable pack of injured and perhaps in some cases dying hunting dogs continue in their discordant progress. When he has ceased his ill-resounding noise, another flat-mouthed mourner, black and grim, against the welkin volleys out his voice. Another and another answer him, clapping their proud tails to the ground below, shaking their scratched ears, bleeding as they go. It's very physical writing here. 6 hounds are vividly described, each one exhausted and cruelly injured after his encounter with the savage boar, and each hound in turn iterates, though in body language as well as in yelps, the self-same miserable message of wounding and defeat. So the boar, we can, I think, conclude quite well. It is made clear. Adonis is one of the casualties. So finally, I want to get on to eyes. I want to conclude with a passage that even in this exceptionally sensuous and imaginative narrative, I think may be reckoned as one of Shakespeare's most brilliant evocations of physical sensation. Not surprisingly, most of the rather small number of scholars who have commented in any detail on Venus and Adonis, but they have been equally struck by this passage. The lines in question describe Venus's shocked apprehension as she suddenly stumbles on the sight that she has most desperately hoped not to see. In her haste, unfortunately spies the foul boar's conquest on her fair delight, which seen, her eyes, as murdered with the view, like stars ashamed of day, themselves withdrew. Or as the snail, whose tender horns being hit, shrinks backward in his shelly cave with pain, and there, all smothered up, in shade doth sit, long after fearing to creep forth again. The homely image of the vulnerable mollusk smothered up in shade anticipates the closing lines of the poem, in which Venus will finally, having failed, her love affair having totally failed, and with the boar killing the boy, Venus will fly far beyond the world of human beings, a world of which she is now forever weary, travelling upwards through the empty skies, where the queen means to immure herself and not be seen. Rather, as the injured snail is tightly enclosed within the refuge of his hard shell, Venus will soon be immured, that is, walled in, very much more splendidly among the remote and inaccessible Olympian gods. Shakespeare's, I'll have to drop a bit here. I was going to have a little digression on people being blinded or nearly blinded in Shakespeare's plays, but I think I should move on. A full chronicle of Shakespeare's eye imagery could fill a large book, but I believe the passage I've just quoted from Venus and Adonis is unique in its metaphorical personification of Venus's eyes. Like two autonomous beings, the two eyes of Venus are murdered by the mere sight of the dead Adonis. Gazing at them closely, Venus's eyes can be imagined also as sharing the acute sensitivity of the humble snail, a creature that probably all of us have witnessed in our time, perhaps as small children, perhaps as gardeners. Like the human eye, a snail needs to be perpetually moist with its own protective liquor, or it will die. Like the human eye, also, the moist snail is sensitive to the slightest physical touch, having what we would now call powerful neural reflexes. We've probably all had encounters with snails of some, perhaps just too disgusted to touch them, but if you do touch them, they certainly respond. Snails frequently figure as decorative features in Elizabethan and Jacobean embroidery. Our ancestors clearly saw decorative beauty in these mysterious features. And Shakespeare's invocation of a snail as a creature who, like a human being, is exceptionally sensitive to pain, is uniquely powerful, and is clearly admired. And I just thought that we'd end with a couple of examples of slightly unexpected, of an Elizabethan vision of nature with snails as clearly regarded as beautiful beings who will enhance a lovely bit of embroidery. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a ramble at the end, but that image of the snail is particularly strong, and I think everybody who's written at any length on Venus and Adonis has singled out that snail simile. Where I've one much further on than I thought I should in time. But I don't know if some people have to go or whether you can stay. I might just have a bit of water.